Welcome back to another great part of our craft series. Today we're especially blessed. We've got Lysley Tenorio, who is a professor at St. Mary's College of California, and is a special treat. He is also my second reader for my MFA thesis. So thank you, Lysley, for coming in today. Thanks. Lysley has been the recipient of the Rome Prize. He has an NEA fellowship. And for all of the San Jose State Spartans out there, he's a former Steinbach Fellow. So he has some great ties to San Jose State as well. So thanks for coming in, Lysley. And we'll start talking a little bit about craft and thinking a little bit about inspiration for the writers out there and future writers watching this series. So Lysley is the author of two collections. So the short story collection, Monstrous, and the book that just came out, The Son of Good Fortune. So we'll be asking questions about both of those. So your first book, Monstrous, is a collection of short stories, and now The Son of Good Fortune is a novel. How different was your process in working on these projects, and what advice would you give for writers still trying to find their medium?
Right. Well, what I learned quickly, so I published the collection of stories, Monstrous, quite a while ago, and I spent a long time working on those stories. I'm a pretty slow writer and an obsessive reviser, so when it was finally out in the world, I felt like, it's done, I'm ready to move on to the next project. The next project was a novel, and I quickly realized that the short form, for me anyway, is not real training ground for the longer form. With a short story, I noticed that I tended to sort of conceptualize the dramatic arc of the piece in my head. And of course, with the revisions, I would make changes, but I had a sense of the world and a sense of the story in terms of plot. I tend to be a plot-driven writer. Plot for me is like a map that or an obstacle course even, that you subject characters to. So you can see, you kind of braid characterization with dramatic action. So it's easier to hold these stories in my head. With the novel, that was much more difficult to do. Of course, it's a longer form, but I realized that I was really living with these characters on a day-to-day basis, trying to get to know them, because you really have to understand who they are externally, internally, over the course of an entire book. So, whereas I was normally plot-driven as a writer, I found myself more focused on character, which is harder for me to develop and to understand. So I was actually building a world around these characters, and more specifically, I was building a world around a mother-son relationship. So I knew specifics about the characters, but what their actual journey was, emotionally, psychologically, that wasn't clear, and I had to build a world around that relationship to foster their evolution. So it was really, it was counterintuitive for me, as someone who's so structured and literally outline stories sometimes, to not have those mechanisms come to me as instinctively for the novel, really difficult. So it was a completely different experience.
So as a little bit of a follow-up question, Lysley, you talked a lot about outlining and the importance of that for Monstrous. How much of the outline process then did you bring to The Son of Good Fortune, or did you spend a lot more time just sort of, as you sort of say, getting to know the characters and sort of focusing on that progression rather than sort of plotting the whole thing out?
Right. I definitely spent more time trying to get to know these characters. And I think that's why I wrote and rewrote seemingly endless times, probably the first 75 pages. Because even though within those first 75 pages, I had a strong sense of what was happening, I wasn't really understanding the characters. And if I didn't really understand the characters, I just wasn't sure how to propel them forward in terms of story. So even though I eventually did looser outlines for the novel, it was really just a long search for understanding who these characters were. And it felt like kind of wandering in the dark a little bit, because even though I tend to be a plot-driven writer, my work is ultimately character-driven. The real stakes happen because, hopefully the reader cares about these characters. and just not knowing who these characters were for a long time was just really, really difficult. And a lot of it was trial and error. A lot of it was writing chapters that I knew weren't going to make it into the final draft, but I just had to find ways to generate material that would help me understand who they were. So it was a long, long process. And it's funny because in some ways, if someone were to ask me, how do you write a short story? And of course, that's a subjective question. Everyone writes differently. I feel like I can answer that question for myself. If somebody asks me, how do you write a novel? Or how did you write your novel? It's so much more difficult to answer. Like sometimes I look back at these years of trying to write this book, and it's hard for me to even remember when it all really came together. You know, it's a strange experience. It really, really was. But I'm just glad I've gotten it done.
Yeah, I mean, that's always a big accomplishment. I've still got a novel that I started in the MFA program sitting in a drawer because I'm still waiting for that moment of gelling. So
I think it is a lot of waiting. You know, I think you have to, for me, I always say I have to wait for the voices to come, which, you know, sounds a little woo-woo, but sometimes hearing the right voice, knowing how you're going to write your story, is the real jumpstart you need to finish, or even just to continue. It takes a while for sure.
yeah, well, thinking about things that take a while and sort of talking through that process, how has being a teacher of creative writing changed the ways in which you read or write a text? So what do you look for most in a story for you to enjoy or learn from as you read? We think a lot about that at the Writing Center, sort of like, how do you read differently when you're looking to just enjoy a text as opposed to learn from a text, or to be inspired by a text? So how has all of that sort of influenced your writing process?
Right. You know, after so many years of writing fiction and teaching fiction, you know, I've come to realize that fiction, or really any kind of creative writing, poetry, creative nonfiction, it's not just information that you're seeking out as a reader, it's experience. Of course, information is important in any creative writing. We've got to relay important facts, details, circumstances, but we need to understand those things through the realm of, or through the filter rather, of experience. So when I'm reading for pleasure, I am really looking to, you know, they say, you know, a book is like an escape. To a certain extent, I am looking at a book as a kind of escape from the immediate moment. I need to be immersed into a story fairly quickly for me to commit to reading a book. And the way to commit to that is to really feel settled into the beginning of an experience. Now, how that happens can vary from book to book, and it's writers have different strategies for that. With some writers, like you say, this idea of world building, you build this very particular universe. That's one way of immersing a reader. Another way of immersing a reader is language. Language is very important to me. That's probably the most immediate draw for me when I'm reading for pleasure is, you know, what are the cadences and just rhythms of the language and the voice that sort of lull me into the narrative. So it's not just what's being written, but how it's being written that I think is vital for any creative writer. So, you know, I think those who want to pursue creative writing really have to develop a sense of writing as a way of giving a reader an experience and not just informing them of things. I think when we write critical essays, analytical papers, which are, you know, require tremendous skills, and it's not easy to do those things well, you're really trying to inform and to persuade. And sometimes that means of persuasion is presenting, you know, the reader with this kind of steady, scholarly or academic voice maybe. But with creative writing, it's about the experience. And it's also about what is not being said on the page. So they really are different parts of the writing brain, I think, and the reading brain.
Yeah, I mean, I think from, you know, having taught your work for many years now at this point, and having read your latest novel, like, I think you do a really good job of trusting your reader too. And thinking about like what you said, keeping those those ideas sometimes unsaid on the page, but knowing that your reader will be able to understand that and sort of fill in those moments. In thinking about this idea about experience too, do you want to talk just briefly, and I know I'm putting you on the spot here, about your endings in particular? Because a lot of people, a lot of short story writers in particular, like to just put that pretty bow, but most of the time you don't put that pretty bow on the end of your stories. So how does that sort of fit into the way that you read for experience? And does that influence the way that you think about sometimes the endings for your books or for your stories?
Right. So with my stories and with the novel, there's this kind of veneer of maybe the strange or the whimsical. There are these kind of weird plots and circumstances, but it's definitely within the realist tradition. You know, there are no fantastical elements in the work. And so because it feels like a kind of realism to me, I need to think about what is emotionally real and what is emotionally truthful. And in real life, nothing really ends, you know, so I need to fight the compulsion to wrap things up neatly, because that's not how life happens. So I think the best way to sort of, you know, present a realistic ending and hopefully bring the story to some kind of conclusions that is satisfying. I work on trying to find an ending that still lingers with a little bit of possibility for the future off the page, so that the reader is left wondering, well, maybe this character might, you know, make one decision later down the road or a different decision down the road. So one of my concerns with the ending is what kind of possibility lingers for these characters emotionally, dramatically. But I also think it's important because our tendency is to think of endings as either happy or sad. I think in most fiction, neither, they're both true. Because nothing is completely positive, nothing is completely negative. So I tend to think of endings as a measure of what the character has gained and what the character has lost over the course of a story. And how can you best conclude a story so that it resonates with that sense of what has been gained and what has been lost. And those things, of course, will be defined by the reader. It's a very subjective way of understanding an ending, but it's really important to, and I tell my students that by the time your character has finished her story, what are her victories over the course of the story, and what are her losses? And what happens when you measure those things against each other? What's left? And what might be possible after that? That's how I've come to look at endings, and endings for many writers, myself included, are really tough, because you want to make it work. The last thing you want is a disappointing ending. That's such a bummer, you know. So that's how I've come to understand and work on endings.
Great. All right. Thinking a little bit about both books and the fact that we are in the heart of Silicon Valley at San Jose State, cities in California often play a prominent role in your stories. Why are places so important in your writing? And how does this idea relate to some of the struggles your characters have with understanding what home means for them?
Mm-hmm. You know, so I've been called a California writer, you know, based on my stories and based on the novel. And I don't think that's a conscious, I don't seek out to write California stories. I think it just so happens that California and cities in California tend to be the best backdrop for the characters that I'm interested in, because most of my characters are Filipino or Filipino American. You know, there's a large Filipino and Filipino American population in California, so it kind of makes sense that their stories would happen in this state. But what I need to be careful of is not to present California in the most expected of ways. That's true for any setting. So if I'm going to set a story in the Bay Area that's about a undocumented mother and son who kind of live these sort of off-kilter lives, you know, I need to ask myself, what about the setting of the Bay Area can evoke and contribute to their development as characters? So, you know, I'm not going to have most scenes take place, you know, on the Golden Gate Bridge, or, you know, the Muir Woods. You know, that might be for another story, but I really have to ask myself, what can I use of the setting, if setting is a dramatic landscape, what provides the most drama? So in the novel, for example, having this undocumented mother and son living just on the fringe of San Francisco in Colma, a town that's not really well known. And when it is well known, it's because it's known for its 17 cemeteries. The dead outnumber the living in Colma. And when I realized that, I thought, how can I play with this? I mean, this feels right in some ways, because as undocumented individuals, they have to live on the fringe. And so to have a town just on the fringe of one of the most famous cities in the world that is really known for its dead population, I don't know, there's something very suggestive in that. So if I'm going to use real places in my fiction, I need to ask myself, what provides the most, evocative landscape of the themes and the particular dramas that I'm interested in.
Yeah, I mean, I think Colma in particular in the story and Hello City, like you were able to find a way to integrate those that it almost felt like a character as well. Like we really understood how those places influence the characters. And I think as particularly to not give too much away for people to read the book, but thinking about those scenes with Joker and visiting Joker, I think really helps to sort of capture what Colma is as a place and the meaning of that place for people too.
Right.
So, yeah, great answer. So to continue on to think about some of these process questions, we've talked a lot about how you've thought about characterization, how you've thought about plot, but now I want to ask a little bit about research. In Monstress, for instance, in a lot of your short stories, it was clear that you did research on actual places. So the I Hotel in San Francisco, and you can still sort of visit that location and hear a little bit about that story, or the Kulian leper colony. So how much did research play a role in your latest book, The Son of Good Fortune?
Yeah, I certainly did research. So one of the themes that the novel is about is living as an undocumented immigrant, specifically to be Filipino and undocumented in America. So I certainly had to do some research, not only just in terms of just the legalities that undocumented immigrants face, but also just some of the experiences. I would read interviews and watch videos of undocumented immigrants speaking about their experiences. And of course, I read a lot and watched a lot of Antonio Vargas, who's probably the most famous undocumented immigrant in America. But what I was finding was that, and I think this was true for the first book as well, when you're accumulating all this information, you feel compelled to incorporate it somehow, to sort of make sure that the book earns its credibility and integrity. But what happens though is sometimes the information and the research can overwhelm the story, and you start losing track of what the story is really about. And I really had to ask myself, what serves the character of Excel, who's the protagonist of the book, and Maxima, his mother. So at a certain point, I watch the news, so I'm always keeping track, but I needed to sort of just separate myself from all the latest developments of DACA and the Dreamers, because I had to resist the urge to incorporate all that into the book. So with the novel and with the stories, it was important to be informed and to build your database of knowledge, but it couldn't overtake what the heart of the story was, which is really this relationship between a mother and son. And realizing that also makes me realize it is a book about undocumented immigrants, but it's a book about so many other things as well. And that's what we strive for when we write a story, is that a story is multiple stories. So making sure that I took just what I needed from my research and from the news and left it at that, and really focused on character, was one of the challenges in writing the book and preparing for the book.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to sort of think about, you had to figure out what was important to really put in the text, rather than to just sort of show everything that you've thought about and say, look, I did my research, here it is.
Right.
So I think that's really important for students to think about. Sometimes you do this extra work, but is all of it going to show in the book? But it was important for you to figure out what needs to go in and what could be left out. Um,
Right.
yeah. So thinking a little bit too, oftentimes when I teach Monstrous, a lot of students talk about the great empathy that you show for your characters. And I saw a lot of that too in The Son of Good Fortune. And you're writing about these characters that oftentimes, if they're undocumented, like you said, they're sort of living on the fringes of society out of necessity. What informs your work as you decide who are these characters and their voices that they're important to share in a story? Like, you know, how do you decide who that narrative voice is going to be given to? And thinking about how you want your readers to sort of connect, perhaps, with these characters.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great question. I think the way I decide whose story it becomes, or whose voice or whose perspective is most centered, whether in a story or a novel, I figured that out by finally understanding what it is I really care about with each story. So the novel, Son of Good Fortune, in its earliest versions was quite different. It was actually about these DVD sniffing dogs in Southeast Asia and these DVD pirates trying to assassinate these dogs. That's based on a true story. And I thought, oh, I got to do something with this. And as much fun as it was to write, I realized that the only substantial material and the only relationship I cared about was between this young Filipino man and his mother, who eventually became Excel and Maxima. So once I realized that was really the heart of the book, this mother-son relationship, I had to ask myself, is it going to be Maxima who is our central consciousness? Is it going to be Excel? I mean, it could be both, obviously, but I realized, I'm most concerned about this young guy, about this guy who doesn't have a sense of who he is, where he belongs, what home could possibly be, and what it could mean. Once I realized those were the questions that I was most drawn to emotionally, that for me, that had an emotional pull. I thought, okay, this will be the perspective from which the book comes. I always want to be careful not to let a character or a narrator become a kind of representative for a larger population. I'm also not naive. If you're a writer who comes from any kind of underrepresented group, anything potentially could be read as this kind of representation. I think it's an unfair responsibility that's put on a lot of minority writers, but that's the reality we live in. But I had to be careful to make sure that I was writing about an individual and not an individual meant to be some kind of proxy for an entire population or movement. But I also needed to remember, hopefully this book will be out in the world, and we don't live in a vacuum. So I also wanted to be sensitive to the way the book could be read and to the ways that these characters could be read, because they'll be read in the context of, well, hopefully the novel, but also just the world at large, and especially in the context of undocumented America. So really trying to figure out who can best speak for the book and who might also, for better or for worse, be seen as a kind of representative for something larger. Those are the decisions and things I need to think about when I'm figuring out, okay, whose story is this?
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot of complex things for you as an author to think about and to try to navigate. So, I mean, how much of that, does that come up in more subsequent drafts, or is that something that you think about from the beginning?
I think I was thinking about it from the beginning, because and of course, the way I think about these characters and the story evolves over the course of writing. But I thought about those things at the beginning, and I think it's ingrained in me because I'm a writer. I'm an American writer, born in the Philippines, raised in an immigrant family. I write about that experience, and that's always going to be seen as a kind of representation, because
Right.
thankfully there are more Filipino and Filipino American writers getting published every year, and that's been so exciting to see. But I think everything I write will always to some extent, be seen through that lens, as this book is meant to represent a larger population. I remember there was a review of Monstrous where the reviewer said the stories were kind of generic, and that's fine. But the reason that she found the book generic was because she put the book down and didn't really get a sense of what it meant to be Filipino. And I thought, these are 8 stories that are kind of weird stories. I don't know how they're meant to represent an entire population. And it's an unfair expectation. I don't think she would have, I'm not comparing myself to Alice Munro, but I don't know that she would pick up a collection of Alice Munros and say, I don't know what it's like to be a white Canadian woman, And so there is this expectation to represent. And as much as I try to resist that responsibility that might be placed on me, I'm also aware that the work can be read that way, and I think it would be foolish to not at least acknowledge that as I'm working.
Yeah, that's a really important point to think about, and that's a great example to talk about. How some reviewers they're sitting there and they're in their own little worlds about what their expectations are for a text.
Right.
So, yeah. All right. Well, we'll end on a positive notes and one of hope. You teach at St. Mary's with, I hope, some motivated graduate students who are eager to work on their craft. But what sort of advice would you give to students who might just come to your readings or events, who are just starting out, who are thinking about trying to write or struggling to fall in love with writing? What would you say to some of those students?
I would say that one of the first things I would bring up is the sort of stark reality that writing, any kind of writing, but creative writing as well, because sometimes creative writing is seen as a hobby, which it can be, but if you mean to pursue this seriously, it's work. It is real work, and it is vital that you look at your writing as your job, even if it's not necessarily the thing that pays the bills. If you're committed to writing a novel, a memoir, a book of poetry, it is work, and there has to be some pleasure in that work, and in knowing that most of your time invested in writing is going to be you at a desk. You have to find a way to see the pleasure in that. To be perfectly honest, that's one of the things I struggle with. Even though I might always be thinking about my work, it doesn't mean I always make it to the desk every day. And sometimes when I get to the desk, it can be really miserable, because you're creating something out of nothing. That's really what you're doing when you're writing, which is kind of a magical thing, this idea of creating this whole world on a blank sheet of paper or a blank screen. But you have to be able to withstand and endure the work. And for me, some people have asked me, what's your favorite part of writing? And I always say finishing. That is, years on both these books, and they were not always pleasurable years, but I have to say that moment of finishing brings such contentment and relief that it makes it worth it. Of course, there are moments when you're writing and you feel like, oh, you finally nail a scene. There's pleasure in that. There's some times where I'm like high-fiving the air when I thought, oh my God, I didn't think I could actually finish that chapter. I didn't think I could figure it out. So there are those little victories along the way that hopefully provide you with the inspiration to keep going. But if you're going to pursue this, and if you think you might be on the verge of falling in love with writing, you got to somehow, if you're not going to fall in love with the work, you at least need to find a way to make it through the work, because that's what writing is.
That's great advice, and thank you for sharing all of that. So again, we've been here talking with Lysley Tenorio. He's the winner of the Rome Prize. He's had an NAA fellowship. He's a former Steinbeck Fellow. So we thank you so much for coming and sharing these ideas. If you want to learn more, your website is just LysleyTenorioAuthor.com. Is that right?
LysleyTenorio.com.
LysleyTenorio.com. And the 2 books, again, I'll show them. I have the old cover of Monstrous, and then his new book, The Son of Good Fortune. So you can check those out and continue to tune in to our San Jose State Writing Center Craft Author Series. So thank you, Lysley, for coming in today.
Thanks so much, Maria. Really appreciate it.